I'm going to hand over to Ian Maddox, who's the chair of the Happold Foundation, just to say a quick few words about the foundation and the City Conversation series.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrew. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this seminar, and for those in the future that will hopefully listen to this as well. The Happold Foundation is a charity set up by Ted Happold some 26 or so years ago, with the aim of promoting the role of engineers in helping solve the challenges facing the world, and to encourage the ableist to pursue a career in engineering in order to improve the built environment for everyone. So to that end, the partners of Bura Happold donate money, and we as a foundation organise ourselves around 4 different themes: human development, where we help engineers and organisation access training and funds in order to get involved in humanitarian projects around the world; futures, which focuses on inspiring primary school age students to engage with STEM subjects and so on; education, which helps students pursue a career in engineering via grants and work experience; and then finally the 4th theme is our thinking theme, of which this event forms part, and we invite people from the industry and beyond to identify issues and suggest solutions to these. So without further ado, I'll pass you on to, I think it's Alistair Young. Alistair, I think you'll make the introductions for today's events, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ian. My name's Alistair Young. I'm a partner at Bura Happold. I'm responsible for our energy practice across our business, both in the UK and across our global offices. And I suppose I've been involved with some of these city conversations in the past, and I think it's a great forum, and I look forward to some lively debate, some good audience participation, which is slightly harder on these online things, but than it used to be in the building centre. But I think we can still have a lively debate. We've got a great panel lined up today, but before we kick off with the panel discussion, I'd just like to, I suppose, draw on a few thoughts, a few themes, and I thought the title was very apt. Are we in danger of wasting a good crisis in the UK particularly? We've seen, unprecedented energy prices the last year or so, driven by a number of factors, but primarily the war in Ukraine. We've seen huge amounts of public subsidy for energy bills, rightly so, to cushion the impact on those less able to pay. I do wonder, however, if we are in danger of wasting this crisis, and indeed probably have wasted the last sort of 10 years or so from an energy efficiency perspective. We're seeing other countries make significant reductions in energy demand and really have a much larger scale energy efficiency drive than we seem to be seeing in the UK. And certainly, in the domestic sector, we still haven't made the big decision around how to decarbonize our homes. We are still waiting for, I think, a really good set of incentives for people to make those changes. Starting to see some changes, I think, in the non-domestic sector, partly driven by things like public sector decarbonisation schemes, big funding announced today, but also I think a lot of businesses, certainly we see our clients committing to the net zero agenda, and of course that's got to start with energy efficiency. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up today, so I will introduce them, I think, one at a time as we go through. And I think we're going to start with Bill Bordas, who's going to sort of set the scene in terms of energy efficiency. Many of you will know Bill. He's a long and storied career in energy efficiency in the built environment, which I can't possibly begin to summarize now. But I think he's often had to be saying that, you need to measure what works and use evidence-based policy rather than sort of policy-based evidence, which often I think we've been guilty of in the UK. So I'll hand over to Bill now to give his thoughts on where we currently are in this energy crisis.
Well, you've introduced me to give a rather different talk than perhaps the one I'm going to give, but never mind, I'm sure it'll come out in the discussion. I hadn't realized that I was on first until now. But let me just think whether we're doing the right thing and thinking about the right thing in relation to this. And the first thing I've got to do, and here are a couple of quotes. You know, are we thinking the right way in terms of moving into a decarbonized Western economy in the context of energy sufficiency, climate justice, and all that sort of thing? Because we are the top 1% or maybe the top 10% of consumers. And how does that relate to the balance of the whole planet? And the second quote is, you know, I've seen too often, I mean, I've been in this game for probably far too long, but I've seen too often something new comes along and people dash at doing it without really questioning what it's for, you know. So great thing about a good engineer is they know where the bridge should be built enough. And what price H-test2, let us think about that, you know. Is that sensible going faster in an environment that we're probably going to have to go slower in? And finally, you know, are we used to things we're not entitled to necessarily anyway? Now, the thing is, people are quite malleable and adaptable, and I'm going to go on a bit later to a number of different stories, past, present, and future. But let's just look at thermal comfort and what our expectations are there. Do we need to retrofit our buildings or our brains or a bit of both? Because if you look historically, comfort's been very socially and culturally determined. And often you get a co-evolution of technologies with people's attitudes to it. And what we take for granted may be a bit more elastic than we might think. So here's something from some work that Elizabeth Shove did for a major EPSERC project a few years ago, looking into the malleability of demand for energy in buildings. And they came up with this rather strange looking clothing, but essentially things like that could mean one's expectations for space heating could be half what goes in the models at the moment. So let's have a look at that in terms of socio-technical landscapes. We've got an existing practice here, say a precisely comfort-controlled building, and that can evolve in various ways. So it might go forward. In fact, a nice example here is for transport, perhaps, you know, in going from combustion engine cars to electric cars. You know, is it all exactly the same and you just have a different engine and a different infrastructure for that? Or might it go somewhere else? Might people say, well, you know, now we've got these things, maybe we can do things in rather different ways. And then after that, you know, it may fall back to earth, or it may remain as an option, or you may transform the way we look at things. Now, interestingly, in a book Elizabeth Shove wrote about 20 years ago called Comfort, Cleanliness and Convenience, where she used the diagram a bit like that. She said it was very interesting to look at the evolution of indoor comfort in Japan, which had actually gone almost the opposite direction of these arrows. You know, Japanese used to be fairly relaxed about it, and now very much the international paragon of an air-conditioned building had become much more the standard in Japan. You're really taking the arrows backwards. And this started really by them seeing that sort of thing of fashionable and modern rather than necessarily as necessary. So to finish off this introduction, I'm just sort of thinking of a table of past, present, and future, possible future attitudes and practice. So in the past, you know, citizens were subjects and very much dominated by priesthoods or dictators. And now we're very much in a consumer and market society in the West, but, you know, partly we might be moving back to being subjects as strong men come along. But we might move forward to a more collaborative and communitarian model. Now, what does this mean for buildings and comfort in buildings? So this is just a quote. You know, we know things aren't working properly, but we don't quite know what we need to do about it. So in buildings, you know, the sort of heritage buildings have lasted a long time. We need to learn from that, because I mean, I was at a firm of architects giving a talk a few weeks ago, and I said, how long do you design your buildings to last? They said 30 years. I mean, this is just not on for a sustainable built environment. So we're going to have to move more towards imaginative reuse. And in comfort, we may need to have to move away, at least in some circumstances, to space conditioning, and working out much more from human comfort, or at least how to adapt and avoid a crisis of discomfort in the most effective and cost-effective and rapid way. And then the agenda for energy may move from efficiency to sufficiency. And then, you know, Macron's picked this up. You know, we're getting to the end of what seemed to be an era of abundance. We need to be very much more careful about it in the future. And then we've got research agenda too, where currently academia seems to have got very distant from practice. And so it could take a long time from feedback from what's going on in the ground to actually influence what is done and pilot it. And, you know, the story of my life's been like that in terms of doing real world research on how buildings actually work, and finding it very, very difficult to get that through to practice and policy making. So we end up with a Grenfell Tower, you know, not very clever. And so it seems to me, therefore, we really need to try and live our way into this future. And that means very clearly learning from examples on the ground that might actually be getting somewhere. So to finish off, let's think a bit about what we might do in terms of indoor comfort. The standards were very much developed in climate labs and may not be so appropriate. You've got a lot of negative influences which we can do things about. There's a whole lot of personal things that can be done in terms of clothing, personal and local systems, and more responsive controls, so systems don't default to on, but are on when they're needed. And interestingly, I've been working a little bit with physiologists in Maastricht University, and they're finding it when you vary the range of internal conditions, of course, not if you get black mold, etc., at the same time, that people, or at least a large proportion of the population, not everybody, of course, because people have all sorts of different genetics, can become fitter. And some diseases of other kinds like asthma may even begin to go away. But of course, you may not be able to achieve those conditions all the time in all types of buildings. So refuges may be important. And of course, health is very important. And however good it might be to radically improve the thermal performance of our buildings, a lot of these things can save carbon tomorrow and not in decades' time. So to recap, this is a possible future agenda on the right. We need to work with people who are prepared to explore it rapidly to see how far we must go. And was the UK Green Building Council and others right when plotting the UK net zero carbon roadmap about 18 months ago to say this? You know, we've got to do fabric first. We can't think about people first. Is that really correct in our current emergency? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I think I'm sure there are a lot of people who are managing on insufficiency at the moment with the
Indeed.
prices that we have seen. But I think it's a really interesting point of view, and certainly when we've done applied research at Buro Happold, we see large factors in efficiency from buildings which are effectively exactly the same, or from energy use rather, and that is very much driven by users. I was interested to see some statistics recently that suggested there was no correlation between energy use and EPC rating in buildings, which was rather maybe not a surprise to Bill, but rather kind of undermines the whole.
I've just done a blog on that.
We're going to move next to Richard Holt, our next panel member. Richard is Director of Global Cities Research at Oxford Economics. He's a long history, a career as an economist in London, Birmingham, and New York, including for the CBI and for Capital Economics, and more recently involved in the West Midlands Enterprise organisation. So Richard is going to give us, I think, maybe more of an economist's view on things. We do like to be multidisciplinary at Buro Happold and the Happold Foundation. So I look forward to hearing from Richard.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I'm going to give you an economist's view, but I will give you my slightly off the top of my head view, and hopefully that'll map to economics in a little bit at least. So it seems to me there's two issues which we're looking at the moment where energy is concerned, and two crises essentially. So first of all, we're just going through an energy price crisis, and we've very narrowly averted an energy availability crisis. And we're all familiar with the former in particular. Fundamentally, these have reflected not really economics, but geopolitics. And I suspect that if you look around the world, whatever view you take about Ukraine over the next 12 months, geopolitical problems are probably going to re-emerge. So whether you take an optimistic or a pessimistic view as to what happens in Ukraine in the next 6 months and what the Russians get up to, there's going to be other problems somewhere. And so the notion of living in a high energy price world, and possibly in a world where availability can sometimes at least be problematic, is kind of something that we need to get used to. It's probably going to be continuing to be important. I do think that in 2023, the most likely forecast for energy prices is that they go sideways or slightly down. So, I mean, oil prices at the end of this year, maybe $80 a barrel compared with $100 a barrel at the end of last year. So maybe moving downwards. But that's kind of a mid-range, most likely best case scenario with a huge range around it. And basically, who knows? Why this matters is that we've all been affected by it, but clearly some people have been affected much worse than others. Those who've been worse hit are those with very high heating bills, those with very high transport costs, and those on low incomes and with low wealth and low savings. Those are the people who've been hard hit. So my area of interest is cities, and I want to ask the question, what's that got to do with cities? And are cities having a better or a worse experience than other places? And it's kind of on the one hand and on the other hand stuff. So if you think about isolated buildings, so away from the sort of the very dense populations of cities, isolated buildings, I'm summarizing incredibly excessively, but nevertheless, isolated buildings are inherently more expensive, harder to heat, unless they're better insulated. And, in the UK, we're certainly not very good at insulation. Private cars are more likely to be used outside of cities, and they're more fuel per head than public transport. But having said that, some cities have lots of very low income families, although some have quite a few of very high income families. So is it a situation where cities are having a particular difficult experience from this energy crisis, or less difficult than other places? Well, the other thing that affects that question is to do with government support. Now, the government support is mainly done at the national level, so it's one country versus another. And for example, one of the things that's been going on is that the amount of government support to householders and consumers that we've had in the UK is not as much as the French have been given. Now, I put these two things together and I get the following sort of story about what's been going on, which is in terms of the energy price crisis, which we've seen, London, compared with other cities in the UK, has probably been better off in the sense that the impact on consumers, on spending and so on has been less. Because although there's a lot of very low income people living in London, there's also a lot of very high income people. And on balance, when you do the sums, when you do the calculation, fairly or unfairly, that kind of evens out in favour of London having had an easier ride of it over the last year than many other cities in the UK and many other non-cities. If I compare London and Paris, actually what we think is going on is that consumer spending in London is really being squeezed this year because of the impact of high energy prices on people's incomes, real incomes and their wealth, coming through much more strongly than it is in Paris because the French government has given much more support. So we've got a situation where the growth of a city in the really short term is actually being affected quite a lot by this simple thing of what gas prices, what energy prices are. So in 2023, the London economy actually declines in terms of GDP. The Paris economy grows quite slowly. I cannot remember a time when that has been true. So really straightforward economic consequences from what we've just seen. So that's one kind of issue, these sorts of short-term issues to do with prices and availability. But as I said, it's essentially a short-term issue, but I think it's a short-term issue which in one guise or another is going to come back again. And then the other big question is clearly the one which we've just been thinking about, thanks to Bill, is to do with the zero carbon energy and the need to transition. Globally, we need to get close to zero carbon and we need to do it fast, otherwise we perish. That's all there is to it, you know? It's really that simple. Either we get to 2 or nearly 2 net zero, or it's all over. You can debate the details, and you should debate the details, and it's fiendishly complicated, but the big story is not really in doubt. The big problems in achieving this are the US and China. And given the geopolitics, that's a bit worrying, but that's not a reason why the rest of us don't need to do anything. We still should be getting on and doing things. And what do we need to do? There's 4 big areas: power stations, manufacturing, transport and buildings. Now, if you're interested, as I am, in cities, then the first 2 are not city-specific stories, whereas transport and buildings, the story for cities is different to other places. And I think comparing cities with other places, I'm mildly on the optimistic side in terms of the changes that cities can make as regards to transport, in the following sense, that short distance travel in urban areas is relatively easy to address through public transport, through active travel, and hence through electrification, whereas long distance, aircraft, trains, heavy goods vehicles, doesn't lend itself to electrification, much more about hydrogen. And in terms of changing the underlying fundamental infrastructure, it's easy to ramp up our electricity infrastructure than it is to create from scratch a hydrogen infrastructure. So clearly I'm simplifying horrendously, yeah, but nevertheless, there's a sense in which you would expect cities to be leading in terms of the addressing the transport side of the net zero challenge. Where buildings are concerned, I think it's not completely clear, and it may be the other way around. Putting it crudely, and you can see I'm being very crude in everything that I say, attaching heat pumps onto 10-story apartment blocks, 1 heat pump per block, is not really on. Having heat pumps for terrace houses in a city like London is quite difficult. These are really quite demanding. It's easier to do that in less dense places. They're difficult to attach, they're difficult to disguise, and so on. Now, I think that in fullness of time, technology may well address that for us. I think technology is going to be much better at addressing the problem of heat pumps are bloody big and imposing and problematic. I think that's probably an easier technical problem than on the hydrogen side. So I suspect that in the fullness of time, we may get into a situation where actually cities start to take the lead in terms of addressing this challenge, but they won't do so in the short term. And similarly, if you think about high density housing favours neighbourhood-based collective heating, high density offices, and so on and so forth. But again, it's not something which we can expect to happen sort of quickly. So my sort of view about the path from where we are to net zero is that we will see cities taking the lead on the transport side, lagging on the building side, but in the fullness of time catching up and perhaps overcoming. And that's the path forward. In terms of the really big challenges are the Americans and the Chinese, and that's outside my sphere of expertise, even more so than what I've just been saying. So I'm going to stop talking.
Thanks, thanks, Richard. And it's probably interesting to reflect that we are now importing quite a lot of our gas from the US, which obviously has gone down a fracking route. Whereas, if we were to draw comparisons as you did with London v Paris, the nuclear fleet although it's been struggling a little bit in France the last year or two, does mean that they're, from an electrical point of view, they're more decoupled from natural gas prices, which has obviously been the root of the current energy crisis, at least on the price side. You segued nicely into building efficiency and heat decarbonisation, which I must say is sort of my area of practice. And I'm not going to start talking about heat pumps and district heating, because I'd be here all night, and we're here to hear from the rest of the panel. But we do have Karen Klomp on the panel. Karen is a principal consultant in sustainability at Turner & Townsend, and very relevantly to the discussion, not only has she spent 20 years in energy efficiency and sustainability in the built environment, she's currently the programme manager for the Mayor of London's Retrofit Accelerator, and that is aiming to transform the way London upgrades its ageing and energy inefficient homes to deliver warm, affordable and ultra low carbon homes. So very much on topic for the conversation. So I'll hand over to Karen, who's got her slides loaded up.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you to the previous speakers. I'd like to share with you an approach to reshaping homes as part of cities. I think we all are quite aware of why we need to retrofit our homes. The residential greenhouse gas emissions in the UK account for 16% of total emissions. 80% of the homes that will still be around in 2050 have already been built. And by 2050, it is the estimate that 80% of the homes will be using a heat pump instead of natural gas for space heating and hot water. Maybe less if Richard's stories holds true. But whatever way you look at it, if you look at EPC-C, which is the current government target, and heat pumps, our electricity grid will not be able to cope with that, which means that we need large-scale deep retrofit of the existing housing stock, which means 25 million homes need to be retrofitted. In line with that, many local authorities have declared a climate emergency in the last few years. And with that, the Mayor of London has set out the ambition to be net zero by 2030. To get our housing stock towards that, the Greater London Authority set up the Retrofit Accelerator for Homes, of which I am Programme Manager, to lay the foundations to scale up deep retrofit, initially in London, but with the view to roll that out England or UK-wide. The accelerator is led by Turner & Townsend in collaboration with Energy Sprong UK, the Carbon Trust, and Comarch for Communications. What we set out to do with the accelerator is to find an approach to get away from the stop-start nature of government funding. So any approach needs to be self-financing in the long term, and it needs to provide for large-scale deep retrofit for London's diverse housing stock. So within the team, we've done market analysis and we found the Energy Sprong standard. Energy Sprong is Dutch for Energy Leap, and it is a standard that sets out the net zero home where people will love to live, and the 4 key principles, as you can see on the screen. Now, 3 reasons why this approach to deep retrofit is very appealing is, for one, it will use modern methods of construction, which will increase productivity and decrease costs the more we use it. It has a long-term performance guarantee. Now, currently in the UK, you can get 10-year guarantee on new homes and 20 years for a new kitchen, but there's no guarantee for retrofit. With the Energy Sprong approach, the contractor will have to give off a guarantee for 10 years that the performance will indeed be as designed, which will also address the performance gap that we currently see between design and actual performance. And the third point why it's very appealing is it's part of a wider approach where residents will be involved as well through a comfort plan, which means that residents will pay a small weekly charge for their guaranteed comfort, which also nicely addresses the split incentive that we usually see between the landlord investing and the resident benefiting. So the comfort plan, very crudely, drawing is not my strong skill, as you can see here. Before the refurbishment, a resident will pay rent to a housing provider and energy bill to the energy company. And after retrofit, they will still pay rent to a housing provider and a leftover residual energy bill to the energy company. But instead of a whole energy bill, they'll pay a comfort charge to the housing provider, who will then reinvest that in future retrofit. What will the resident get for that? It's what they call the Energy Sprong promise as part of the whole approach. They will get 21 degrees all year round temperatures, 18 degrees in bedrooms. They will have a certain amount of hot water, and they will have, through PV panels and where necessary batteries, guaranteed energy plug load. They will still be connected to the grid, so they can always draw down more from the grid. And they'll have a retrofitted home that looks nice, feels good, and sounds good. Just to provide a little bit of context, in the UK each year, and mind these are numbers, very rough estimates from before the latest massive price increase that we are all suffering from. Around 5 billion is spent by social housing providers on existing social housing stock in maintenance and repairs, and about 4 billion is spent by social housing tenants on energy bills. And the Energy Sprong approach means, by doing the deep retrofit, whole house retrofit, part of those maintenance and repairs costs and part of those energy bills will actually go to the housing provider to reinvest in their stock, to make the homes fit for the future and insulate residents against future price rises. So what's been happening in the UK so far? It's a hugely promising approach, but what's actually been happening? So far, there's been 3 small pilot projects in Nottingham, in Malden, and in Sutton, left to right, which have proven that the contractual and the performance model actually work, but the costs are still too high, as we've seen from these 3 projects, which means that we get to a chicken and egg problem where the housing providers cannot justify to invest in the housing stock, and the supply chain cannot justify investing without a pipeline, investing to get the cost down. Which is why we've looked to the Netherlands, where Energy Sprong, the approach originates, and how they've gotten across the pipeline chicken and egg problem there is to work with multiple landlords, social housing landlords, thereby stimulating the supply chain, who will then in turn invest in innovation, industrialization, and digitization, leading to the required cost reduction. So in the UK, we're not there yet, but we have found a few London boroughs with a strategic vision who are willing to invest. And with those London boroughs, and together with the Greater London Authority, we've set up the Innovation Partnership. Now, the Innovation Partnership procurement model is an innovative model, which can only be used when the certain product or service can be specified, but at the moment doesn't currently exist in the market. which is what we have here with the energy sprung specification, but not really a whole house solution to deliver that. So the GLA as contracting authority has pulled together 4 contractors, United Living, Osborne, the Bell Group and Equans, and 9 in total housing providers who between them have committed 1,800 homes over the lifetime of the partnership, as well as funding, partly grant funding, partly match funding. The partnership is a long-term investment in 3 stages. Stage 0 was to select the suppliers, the 4 that I mentioned before. Then the next step, which is where we're currently at, is the whole development process on fine-tuning the approach, which will lead to a very nice carrot of a £10 billion framework nationally for those 4 providers. Going into the development process, each of the 4 providers, contractors, is paired with a housing provider, which will work through the 4 stages end to end. And at the end of each stage, there is a go, no-go moment for the housing provider to say yes or no, going through to the next stage. At the moment, we're in the prototype stage, the second stage, where we validate designs that the solution providers, the contractors, have drawn up. And the next stage will be a scaling up and reduction of cost at every stage by getting more and more homes into the partnership and fine-tuning the approach. At the end, the 4th stage, commercialization, it's supposed to stand on its own feet without government intervention. But this will only work if we industrialize, innovate, and collaborate across the partnership, which is what we're doing with the newly formed collaboration hub, where all 4 contractors and the housing providers, as well as the supply chain, are really working together and open book approaches, helping each other to get a part of that massive pie of £10 million at the end. So where are we now? As I mentioned, we're in the prototype stage, which means 100 homes in 5 different projects are currently on the ground. In Hammersmith and Fulham, we're looking at a panelized solution. This is actually a photo of Nottingham, because we won't start in Hammersmith and Fulham until June with installing the panels on the 17 properties there. But this will give you an idea. Whole panels are being craned in to insulate the homes. In Barking and Dagenham, we have a kit of parts solution from Ultraframe, which is a supplier that was not active in the retrofit market before the Innovation Partnership started. So we're already seeing the market being created here. And rather than the full panels, such as in Hammersmith and Fulham and Nottingham, this solution comes in parts on site, arrives in parts on site, which means that no crane is necessary, which means that it will be more suitable for densely populated urban areas. In Enfield, we have a slightly more standard Innovari panel solution, but the innovation here is the white box that you see in the middle there, which is the vent box. It is placed outside, which means that the housing provider will have access to change the filters in the ventilation system, and the ducting is all in the underneath the fabric skin. So really neatly worked into that without having to disturb the residents inside their homes. And in Sutton, we're looking at a monodraft solution, an energy system in a box. So that the black porch that you see there houses the heat pump, the PV inverter, water storage vessels, and monitoring and verification equipment to make sure that indeed the performance as designed is guaranteed. So going back to this slide, what have we achieved so far? So we've put together the framework and started the partnership in the second stage of 4 stages. There's a 10-year guarantee that the solution providers, the contractors, are guaranteeing, which didn't exist before. We're looking at non-intrusive solutions. No decanting is necessary. Comfort plans, again, new in the market, are being signed by residents whose homes will be retrofitted. I won't lie, it's still an issue with costs, quite the challenge but that's no surprise considering the massive inflation that we've seen in the market. And whether or not the residents are happy and find their homes attractive, we are still working on the prototype schemes. So we'll know more in a few months' time. So it is a challenge. It might be a good way to address retrofit at scale, and therefore changing the way we live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Really interesting range of solutions emerging there, and clearly a lot of innovation being driven by that sort of market making process. It's interesting that you touched on electrification and the grid constraint from electrification of heat particularly, and that kind of segues nicely into our next speaker. So I'm pleased to welcome Ian Cameron, who's Director of Customer Services and Innovation at UK Power Networks. Ian's been at UK Power for about 10 years, prior to which he worked at Eskom, which is the grid power operator in South Africa. Ian's roles moved from plugging in renewables to the grid, which help decarbonise the supply, to dealing with customer services and innovation, and that is often, I think, at the kind of that crossover of decarbonising or electrifying transport and heating, and doing that in a way that doesn't push up customer bills excessively. And so I'm pleased to welcome Ian as our final panelist. And after Ian's made his contribution, we'll then go on to take questions from the audience. So over to you, Ian. We can see your slides.
Fabulous. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the Apple Foundation for giving me the opportunity to come and join this panel. So I suppose to some degree, the way I interpreted the question or the briefing today was more about which crisis first, because as you'll get to see as I go through my slides, there are many crises in front of us at the moment. And as a network, it's about which ones and when do you respond, and to what nth. So maybe just to kick off, and I always seem to have to say this at the start, because especially now in an energy crisis, I need to just differentiate who and what I do in that part of that game. And in reality, we are ultimately a distribution network operator. So the grid per se, the cables, the wires that transport the energy between wherever they're generated to where they're consumed, either in a customer's home or businesses. So we operate 3 license areas which serve a population of circa 20 million customers in the southeast, London, and the east of England. And in total, our grid has a peak load of around 16 gigawatts. And we haven't seen 16 gigawatts for about 12, 18 months. So that tells me that it's actually on a downward trend, not an upward trend. So I think this winter, the highest we've got is just under 15 gigawatts. So with that in mind, a part of the bill, it's about half a cost of coffee a week. I think my team now tell me half a cost of coffee a week is to pay for the cables, the wires, etc., to facilitate whatever customers want to do with it. And I think that's the key point, is what do customers want from their grid operators, the key point. And every year when we set out and we do a research program with customers, and of about sometimes 20, 30,000 customers per year, we set out, say, what are the key challenges that you want us to focus on? And believe it or not, there's always been 3. Since I've been doing this for the last 5, 6, 7 years now, there's always been the 3 that have reoccurred. It's around make sure it's not too costly. So make sure you keep your costs down as part of the grid. Make sure you look after those who can't be supported. So make sure that there's opportunities as you as a grid, and surprisingly so, make sure you look after the communities. There's a social element to what they want from their local grid operator. And then thirdly is the environment. Not net zero, we all call it net zero, but customers in the main just talk about the environment in the main. Those 3 have always been a priority. What's interesting is how they turn, of which one of those are first, second, and third each year. 2021, Blue Planet was on, we were all in COVID. And what we found, David Attenborough swung everybody's opinion, and net zero, all the customers saying, you've got to sort out the planet. Can't believe what's going on. I can't believe my home is one of the most polluting parts of my life. Nobody told me. Why is nobody telling me this? Fast forward a little bit, we go into cost of energy crisis, affordability crisis, and now cost bar none is a priority. So I suppose to some degree, all of these are crises in their own form. The question we have as a grid operator is we can't, as an infrastructure business, we can't sway one way or the other by depending on whatever political landscape or whatever priorities might be in front of us, because they're all important, is the simple answer to those. What we've recently found in the last 12 months, we've added a fourth, because resilience as a result of what previous speakers have spoke about around the dependence on where our energy comes from, our own energy resilience. You're subjected to greater events, major events like storms, where we've had significant periods of without power and significant damage we haven't seen for 3-4 decades. Customers now are saying resilience is important, right? I want to make sure the energy that I use is coming from somewhere I can control. And secondly, I want to make sure that it stays on as long as possible, especially when more and more of my life is starting to be powered by electricity. So it's now made what I would class as a play of fourth place. And again, is it more important? It's probably on a par today with net zero. If I went and asked customers live today, they will go, it's probably the same importance to me. But what they've told me this year is affordability, number one, Ian. So be careful where you spend your money. Secondly, look after those who can't be looked after. So there's still a very big social conscience around how we support. And as networks, we support fuel poverty, about 40,000 customers a year. We, under the consumer vulnerability programs, we spend time trying to make sure we remove barriers to customers to participate in smart, flexible solutions. So that's where they want us to spend our time in terms of vulnerability. So I suppose the message to us all is the value of our programs has clearly got to be where the Venn intersects. Because if these are all important, they have been for some period of time, and they change by the situation or the latest crises we are in, they're all important. Because if I really pulled out cost, we would have a problem with net zero. If I really spent my way, built the network to the size needed, costs would shoot out. Customers in vulnerable situations couldn't afford to pay. They'd be disproportionately impacted. Yes, you might get more resilience by building a bigger network. I think the key is that the programs that deliver all four of those things are the most, or the least regret programs, the most front of mind, shovel-ready programs we should be moving forward with. Some of the challenges around net zero haven't been determined. Previous speakers have spoke about that. At what point do we make decisions around our buildings, etc., and how they'll be heated? As electricity networks, we know we have a part to play in that. We're not really sure exactly when that part is and to what end. It's quite clear in things like in communities like off-gas grid communities where there isn't another vector. The answer is just go straight to electricity and do it now efficiently. You've got a long opportunity to pay off their investment. Customers can get ready, work with communities, but less so in high built-up areas is what is the right vector of choice, because time is ticking as we need to make these decisions. So in summary on this slide is there are many priorities and they change. So we've got to be very careful of short-sighted flittering between them. They're all going to be important over the next 10, 15 years. So if we deep dive a little bit just quickly into net zero, and one of the previous speakers spoke around, there's many things we need to do. I think Karen said was, we've got to make sure that we decarbonize our electricity system. And it's been a pretty good track record for electricity, specifically at a distribution level. We have embedded decentralized generation of around 9.4 gigawatts. And remember, about a peak of just short of 15 right now. That's a significant amount as local generation, albeit only 7.3, and it's a growing number every day, is renewables. So local renewables supporting. So you get a level of resilience with local. You get a level of decarbonization, and you hopefully get a level of vulnerability or support in a community environment with local solutions. We've got 10 gigawatts of distributed generation accepted in the queue. So yes, we might have 9 connected. There are 10 in a queue ready to connect. Various challenges that developers face around planning and other things to get those online. 370 megawatts of storage with another 3 gigawatts in the queue. Again, in a highly renewables energy system, you need a lot more renewables and a lot more storage to be able to serve the need. And if you fast forward that to 2030, we expect that generation could be anything above the 13.5 gigawatts. So our networks, specifically in the east, for a significant period of the year, months of the year now, we find they are net exporters. So they export out of the region through the transmission system to another region. So we find our eastern network feeding towards London, feeding towards the Midlands in certain months of the year, our southern network feeding towards London, towards the west. So that's a good situation for local resilience and efficiency. We then move our mind. So you've got a pretty good job happening around electricity, not yet done, but there's an ambition by 2035 for the grid to be totally decarbonized. It's totally possible. Then you can start having discussions around how you serve transport out of that vector. Today we have 440,000 electric vehicles charging of our network today, but that's a significant step change between today and 2030, where we expect anything between 2.6 and 4.5 million. And that's a big volatility of what we need to prepare for. The key is where you do it, at what cost. So we could go and prepare for 4.5 million at a cost that impacts vulnerability and cost. Is that the right thing to do? Or is it about to do it just in time? Yes, that might trade off a little bit against net zero. But again, as I started, there's that fine balance and trade-off that we have to get right. Not being a blocker, but also not spending as if there's no tomorrow. So a load of opportunities still on decarbonising transport, loads more work to do, but something we've been focusing, specifically myself on the innovation side, for the last 5 or 6 years. So I'm fairly comfortable it's in probably more of a business as usual situation to connect electric vehicles to the grid. We have around 7,500 domestic customers connecting electric vehicles, charge points to our grid at home today, where they have an opportunity to park off street. So transport's at the start of its journey, growing annually and by multiples. Then we move over to buildings, and we have a substantially lower volume in heat pumps than we expect at this point. I think when we cast our minds back to our last price control, we should have by today had about 180,000 heat pumps connected. And that's what we thought 8-9 years ago. We're at 30,000 with ambitions at 240,000 need to be the annual volume or run rate within 6 years. There's a lot needs to happen for that to be the case. We spoke about the type of buildings, how we make sure those buildings are efficient before you start putting them over to electricity. All those things need to happen. The work that Karen spoke about are absolutely key before you start to move to electricity. And with a view that should the turn of the decade come, this network we expect to have around 700,000 to 1.2 million heat pumps connected. So that's still not a significant amount. If you think there's circa 8.4 million households, about 8,400,000 businesses, that's insignificant compared to the size of the challenge we have thereafter after 2030. So I suppose in summary, the message is, I don't think it's a simple answer. I don't think there's one answer that goes, yes, we're just going to spend our way out. You've got to consider all of those things. And it takes so many actors. To some degree, I often say it's the Avengers need to assemble on this challenge. And you can't come at it from just a buildings landscape. You've got to come at it from a whole system and landscape. But we've made a good track record. I do a lot of international speaking, and I'm always proud to be in the UK to look at what we have achieved. But we're at the foothills of the challenge that we've got ahead of us, specifically around buildings. Transport, I would say we are one of the leading countries in the world. Grid, most definitely, are unarguably the leading country in the world about how we decarbonize and the things we're doing. But buildings, I would say we are considerably behind. So some work to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for giving us your perspective as the grid operator. Really interesting to see the changes you're expecting to see in your customers in terms of the types of loads they are applying to your networks. And I know, if those heat pump numbers ramp up significantly, that has a major impact. We've done some work looking at that, and it's interesting the combination of electrification of heating and the retrofit that Karen was talking about really helps to mitigate that impact on the grid, but there is then a challenge of affordability. So we've I suppose finished with the set piece for the panel members, and I'd like to invite members of the audience to put questions in the chat, which we can then put to the speakers. We have had a few questions, so I will take my chair's prerogative and try to pick one out. I think we've got one about embodied carbon, and I wondered, whether the panel have a view, in terms of we're talking about net zero from an operational perspective. Do we think that embodied carbon is a big factor in decarbonising the built environment? Should we be worried about that in an energy crisis, or should we be cracking on with measures that start to reduce our energy bills now? So I'll maybe put that to Karen to start with.
At the moment, it's not part of the energy sprung performance criteria. That doesn't mean that the local authorities that we work with aren't interested in it. We've seen in the specification that they put forward themselves, in addition to the energy performance criteria, they are looking at trying to promote those materials that are less carbon intensive. So yes and no, but we've seen in Germany, where they also have energy sprung retrofits, there's real focus on low carbon materials there. So it can easily be incorporated in the criteria.
Bill, do you have a view on embodied carbon and retrofit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to balance out the embodied and operational carbon over the building stock and over the trajectory to, the end of the rainbow, where all goods and services and energy are zero carbon. So I think it's really important to take a balanced view of this. And that's why my sort of soft retrofit, what we do at the human side, can be very important to start things off. But in terms of doing deeper interventions, it's very much the right measures to the right extent at the right time. And so if you can actually coordinate those sort of activities with times when a building needs refurbishing anyway or whatever, then that will probably give you a better mix than forcing a place in an area where it might be rather expensive or where things have got a longer life to go in relation to something that's a soft touch. But scaling is, of course, really important too.
Richard, do you have a view on that? I mean, do we think embodied carbon gets wrapped up in broader emissions reporting, and we should crack on with things in the built environment and leave that to the manufacturers to worry about, or is there a role in the built environment in driving that supply chain?
What we are seeing from companies is that they are incredibly interested in it. That companies have a good handle on what they themselves are doing, but they find themselves to be very ignorant of their supply chain, and they're being held responsible for the entire supply chain. And they are coming to us and saying, can you help me to understand my supply chain in order that I can address not only what's going on for those who supply me who are based in the UK, but those who are based around the world, both in terms of things like embodied carbon and also in terms of things like vulnerability to climate change shocks. So both of those areas are very much on the agenda of the business sector at the moment.
Thanks, Richard. And sort of further question from the floor, as it were, or rather observation about maintaining energy security, particularly in that kind of that peak event period, through providing discounts or incentives for people to use less. I know I'm an Octopus Energy customer, so I've got our bills now. We've got this sharing session or saving sessions, so there's some incentives to turn off the heat pump at that particular time, or more recently have moved on to their COSI tariff, which is a kind of a time of use tariff for the heat pump customers. I wonder whether we think that has a role to play, or is there a danger there that sort of more able to navigate that market benefit, and the costs are kind of borne by others, or is it a win-win? I'll maybe put that to Ian as the obvious kind of person to pick that up.
Yeah, I suppose to some degree what we are articulating there is, and I'll give you a stat maybe to start, is our grid, the 3 licenses we operate, is on average 60% utilized. So most people go, oh, the grid's never going to cope. But the grid at the main was built to cope in the evenings when everyone got home and started cooking and put the lights on. And that's inherently the habits that we have seen from customers. What we now are able to see is, could you be flexible? Could you ask a customer for their flexibility to use their network at a different time to make a savings? So what you end up saying is, actually, I have an asset that I could use 24/7. If I can use that at a higher utilization rate, you don't have to put up the cost, so that the cost bubble that I covered is tick. You use the network you have, you can still decarbonize, you can still do all that. And to some point, it kicks off where Bill was talking about is, maybe we need to change the way we've behaved, because we've always behaved that way. But if you have a grid that has 15 gigawatts of capacity built into it, how do you use that 15 gigawatts most optimally? And an example of what you saw this year was, just for a national cause, going, could you move some of your use to a different time because we're running out of generation in the country? Would you mind waiting an hour? That's a simple question. And flexibility, we've been running for the last 5 years, does something similar. It says, at a very locational area, rather than me changing the transformer up the street, could I incentivize you to move your electric vehicle charging maybe later in the day? And by that case, could I put a couple of pennies on the kilowatt hour that the supplier has with you, that you would move that? And yes, we saw that, a project shift that we delivered over about 2,000 customers. 80% of customers moved their usage from the peak in the evening to the morning to where the cheapest price was, with zero inconvenience to them. So there are opportunities to utilize the infrastructure we have today in different ways and more efficiently. Again, you tick 3 or 4 Venns on that priorities for customers in that way.
Thanks, Ian. Karen, do you have any thoughts on that from your experience of the retrofit market?
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that plays not necessarily in connection with Energy Sprong, although we are also talking to Octopus to see how this could be incorporated. However, we are currently bombarding the residents with so many new things already that they might freak out if we add this as well, which is, we need to take them on the journey. And yeah, Energy Sprong, but that first leap is big enough as it is, but it's definitely something that we're keeping in our back of our mind, and also for single measures retrofit that we're also working on at Turner & Townsend. It's absolutely something that's high on the agenda. Yes.
I think it's really interesting you to see, and obviously it varies by home, but the more efficient, or the more thermally efficient your home, and the less heat you lose, per hour, the better able in a way you are to participate in that type of market. And certainly we've been trying to participate in that. I've had a few comments from my fellow inmates about the temperature drop in the house between 4 and 7, but I think it's, if you can paint it as being for a good cause, whether that's for saving money, as Ian mentioned, or saving the planet and taking a different approach to thermal comfort, as Bill mentioned. I think that it's interesting how by experimenting with these things we can see that people are much more able to cope with change than perhaps us sort of experts in our ivory towers are comfortable with. Maybe some of our political leaders are comfortable with. Karen, there's a question in the discussion about cost implications of the deep retrofit, and how does that impact on cost for tenants and owners of buildings, and also what are the general cost issues? I think you had a graph up showing some of the sort of retrofit costs per home, so I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, at the moment it's quite, with the massive inflation in energy costs that we've seen, it's very hard to say how much residents will actually save, because they're still connected to the grid. and they will still need to use a little bit of power from the grid. What we can say is that in terms of greenhouse carbon emission reductions for the 5 properties that are currently in the prototype stage, we're looking at a 90% carbon emission reduction compared to the current state. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, a 90% lowering of the energy bill, because we're also going electric and doing away with the gas. But we are very confident that consumption-wise, it will be at least 75% less units consumed. How much that then translates into actual cost is a different question. For the landlords, we've been looking at what they spend. If possible, it's not always split out very nicely in maintenance and repairs on the properties that we're retrofitting, to see how much, if the performance of the whole property is guaranteed, and the guarantees for a new roof and for walls and everything else, wall panels, is guaranteed for the next 15 to 20 years. How much will that save them in maintenance and repair costs, which then goes back into the business case for the housing association, for the housing provider, I should say. So there are calculations there. Unfortunately, not all housing providers bookkeeping is such that we can actually really split out and make that business case in such a way.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to move on to heat pumps, because a couple of the speakers, in fact, I think at least 3 of you touched on heat pumps, and Ian, you picked up on there being far fewer on your network than perhaps was expected a few years ago. And I think I also noted the figures for installations the last 12 months in the UK were about 55,000 per year, and the government's own policies to be running at 600,000 a year. Not too far away from now, and there's obviously a big gap there. What's your understanding of the reasons for that reduced or lack of increase in uptake?
I'm happy to start. I would say the first is understanding. Have a test, go down the pub if that's where you go, and ask anybody if they have what their decarbonisation plan looks like for their life and their home. I think you'll have to go around the pub a few times to work out somebody that goes, yeah, I know I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it this, that, next. In reality, what I see is customers start with solar, just basic solar. They have a go and they go, well, it seems mad. I'm just exporting all this to the grid and I'm not getting paid a hell of a lot for it. So I may as well get myself a battery. That's normally the step they've taken. They used to go solar EV, now they're going solar battery. And then they go, well, I'm storing all this. Actually, I could power my EV with this as well. They'll get an EV if they can afford it. And then thirdly, the last thing they consider is a heat pump. And even, I'm in that journey. I've got a fully smart home, but it's all electric. And I'm considering maybe I need to, I've got electric underfloor heating. It's not the most efficient. I'm looking at, could I consider going to a heat pump? And it's just complex for me. And I'm going, well, that's a bit hard. So I'm a person that's in the know. We did some work with the Buro Happold team and community itself, was actually looking at how do you help a customer build that plan so they can almost set their journey for the future and then just edge away at it. So almost when you sell your home, you've got an MOT history, right? Full service history. This is where I am in my service plan. This is my decarbonisation plan. And that takes a huge amount of engagement, understanding, and demystifying to some degree of the complexities of doing this. So that's the first part. Second part is expensive. In reality, it's expensive, even though there's a lot of great work with Octopus, Centrica, British Gas, trying to look at reducing those costs to some degree on parity with where we see boilers today. But that's not here today. Right? And with a grant, even it's still expensive. So with that in the case, we offer free fuse upgrade. We'll offer you a free up to 100 amps supply at your home, which is plenty to decarbonize your whole life, free of charge. Why aren't people running through the door going, I'm going to get loads of them? I think those are the top barriers. I'll let the other panelists add to that, but I would say to start, there are 2 key ones there.
Well, I was certainly very glad of the 100 amp upgrade when we did our heat pump. Richard, you touched on barriers to uptake in your contribution, I think, around some aesthetics and some sort of practical ownership issues. Would you like to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I think there's 2 sorts of barriers. There's the physical barrier, the size of the thing, the fact that it's ugly and so on. I suspect that if you take a 20 or 30-year view, technology will deal with that. Maybe it'll deal with it in 5 years, but I think that's a problem that in time can be addressed. I could be wrong on that, but I suspect it's addressable. The other one is the financial one. And kind of what you've got here is very high upfront capital costs. They cost a lot to buy. Yeah. In principle, over the full life, they should actually pay a decent rate of return. If they are reducing the amount of energy that you need, if they need less maintenance than old-fashioned systems, and that, by the way, applies to electric buses in the same way, yeah, there should be loads of ways in which actually, over a lifetime, it's actually rather a good deal. In addition to which, the cost of these should, in the future, come down. It's the chicken and egg problem that Karen referred to. The more that people buy, the less they're going to cost and so on. So maybe this is a temporary problem which we will overcome. But just focusing on that capital cost versus lifetime returns, in principle, that's the sort of problem that banks should deal with. Yeah, this is a very familiar problem. Every company that needs to invest faces this. Every time you want to buy a house, you've got the same problem. You have to pay a lot of money up front. Yeah. So we're absolutely familiar with this. And so if it's not happening, then there's probably two sorts of reasons for it. Firstly, it's quite tricky because in order to think what the lifetime return might be, how much money you're going to save over time, you need to have a view about future electricity prices or future energy prices more generally. Yeah. And if you think that's easy, then you haven't been looking out of the window for the last 12 months. Yeah. So there's that problem. But I think more fundamentally, it's the fact that our financial system requests and requires a high rate of return and a very short payback period. The implication of that is that what we've got here is a financial system problem manifesting itself as what seems to be a technological and a climate change problem, but actually it's a problem with the financial system. And if that's the case, then that's what we need to address. And if you can't find a solution to that, then at the end of the day, one way or another, the public sector has to take on the burden because that's what the public sector is there for. Yeah. When the market fails, it's the job of the public sector to address it, and they just have to raise your taxes and my taxes, at which point it becomes a political problem. So it shifts from being a technical problem to being a financial problem to being a political problem. It's not fundamentally, I think, a technical problem. I think the fact that they are big boxes and they're ugly, and if you try and stick them on the wall of a flat 5 stories in the air, it's going to fall off and fall on somebody's head. I think that's a problem that can be addressed. It's the other problems that really we need to be worrying about.
I mean, sound interesting. You know, when I visited environments where air conditioning, which obviously heat pump systems are de rigueur, then they are often, as you say, quite prominent on the sides of
Yes.
buildings, and not to everybody's.
They're not very beautiful.
You touched on finance, but you also I think regulation is another area of that's relevant here. And I was just I mean, it's probably, in fairness, before my time in the industry, the introduction of mandatory condensing boilers, or just around the time I was starting out. I wondered whether there's a correlation there. Is there something to be learned from that and this switch of heating technology? Because I think one of the reasons the costs of heat pumps are high, it's not fundamentally about the technology per se. We're often incorporating the costs of shifting from a kind of high temperature heating system, using gas, into a low temperature system where you can run your system at much lower temperatures, and that needs a new hot water tank and potentially some radiator upgrades and so on. But Bill, I wondered if you could kind of come at it from that regulatory and system engineering approach. I
think in a lot of these measures, both in retrofit and in the engineering aspects, that there is a lack of confidence that, the suppliers will get things right. And so there does seem to be an area too of it upskilling. I mean, a lot of heat pumps that have been installed are certainly not operating optimally. And yet often they have very sophisticated controls that would allow them to operate optimally, but it's a little bit more of a hassle for the installer to do it. So there's a whole area of capacity building, I think, within the country. And the government isn't very good at doing that. But it's something that can be very difficult for the industry to do without government support. But it's not necessarily a hard regulatory hammer. It's very much being able to accelerate the path in an industry that doesn't move very fast.
Thanks, Bill. And we've had a very thought-provoking question about, how do we see, how does the panel see city life changing in response to, changes in energy security, changes in energy markets, and decarbonisation? Will we be living our lives in a different way? I'll maybe go back to you for that question, Bill. I think you touched on the idea of community warm hubs and cool hubs and other different ways of adapting to our future climate.
I mean, I think there is an issue in current policy and things that it tends to be, too individual consumer related. And in cities, there's a lot of opportunity for doing things collectively. And that applies to heat pumps too. You can put them on little local networks and that sort of thing. So, and then obviously there are 15-minute city ideas and things of that kind. And as you've also said, the idea, I mean, if you look at global South type communities and things there, or indeed historically, people tend to come together in places where they can, take refuge from something when that's necessary. And we've got more individualistic in the way the West has gone in the last 100 years. But I think there is opportunity in many ways to work together to get solutions which, do have a lower footprint, but also have considerable community benefits.
And Ian, is there anything in that from your point of view as a grid operator? Would it make your life easier if we had car sharing rather than I think it was up to 4.6 million EVs parked on people's drives or in the street using public facilities?
I'm not sure I have an opinion what the right or wrong way is, but what we do see across our circa 127 local authorities is all of the above exist, right? And we've got to cater as an electricity network for all of them. Rural networks where you need a car to be able to live. It's just part of the daily commute. But in cities, the GLA, vastly different strategies about actually reducing and sharing more. The strategies are definitely coming through. And if you look at them per head count, let's go per head count. Yes, the volume of energy consumed is vastly lower that we need to provide on the grid. So there is a lot to be said about proper planning for communities, but a whole system planning, not simply just, if I would go back 2-3 years, not long ago, Alistair, we as electricity networks, we weren't even at the table in local area energy planning. We were not even invited to have the discussion. It was just simply develop your local plan, pass the network, and then go, well, just build it. That's what we're going to do. In reality, now we've got the opportunity to actually have a seat, have those discussions and go, well, if you consider this from an energy point of view, you might have a slightly lower overall cost to build a network. There's scope 1, scope 3 opportunity there for you. Yep. Now we are able to have those, but they are early discussions. We've got some way to go to get to a fully integrated, autonomous, a local area energy plan actually leads to some form of investment case in the network. Loads of good work to happen over the next 2 to 3 years. The commitments we've made in our business plans to actually physically support that with money to build the community's ability to consider what energy engineering they need, to build capacity in terms of resources and expertise. We've employed 20 people to go out and actually work with local authorities to help them plan their their local area energy plans. And ultimately, what we then need is the right regulatory framework that once we've all agreed in that community what the right outcome is, to actually pull on the investments needed for that energy system, whatever that system looks like, to actually start to pull on that investment, start getting it ready. Because then at that point, everybody's following one single plan. Everybody's got a plan. We understand Avenger, energy knows what we have to do to play the game. Everyone has a role to play. At the moment, it's a bit of a free-for-all. Anybody who takes the lead. Yes, a bit of the squeaky wheel syndrome at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I think it's planning's been maybe a slightly dirty word in the UK, maybe compared to some of our European neighbours, and it's something we haven't liked to do. I think it's essential, really, for a cost optimal, if you like, or a just transition, that we have some form of planning. The local area plan is really interesting angle. We just started supporting Westminster Council with that, and the idea that you can help a local authority plan what their city might look like in 5, 10, 20 years time, and what those energy systems might look like is really interesting. I think there are a huge range of variables, and still some big challenges in how that, as you say, gets taken forward to implementing. I'm just conscious of keeping my eye on time as chair, and I thought I might ask each of the panel members to make a sort of closing remark, if you like, on their reflections on the discussion, and then I'll pass to Andrew Scoones to close up the discussion on behalf of Happold Trust. So I think, Karen, I thought I might start with you, if that's okay. Get your reflections on this conversation.
Yeah, I think what we've learned mostly is that it needs to be a holistic approach, and what you finished just now with, Alistair, about planning. It requires a nationwide plan on how we're going to deal with energy in the wider sense of the word, which has been sorely lacking, unfortunately. But both transport, generation, the housing will all have a role to play, and that there's no one solution. I'm firmly committed to Energy Sprong, as it will come as no surprise, but it's not just the one solution there either. It's horses for courses, what will work best, and how does it fit in with all the other sectors that also need to decarbonise.
Thanks, Karen, and maybe go to Bill next.
Oh dear, well, I had a number of keywords, which were particularly imagination and collaboration, and getting to the best mixes you can, and particularly this rapid feedback on what's working and what isn't, and what we need to junk and what we need to improve, and very much uniting the top down with the bottom up and the middle out. A lot of wisdom may be there in the local communities, which professionals in the past haven't necessarily been very good at extracting.
Thanks, Bill. And Ian, would you like to go next for us?
Yeah, mine short and sweet is, I think we need to work the intersections hard now and keep an eye on the rest of those barriers as we go, because there's loads of challenges on consumers and customers today. I don't know if it's the right decision to be pushing any one of them hard right now, but working in those intersections is a no regrets opportunity.
Thanks, Ian. And Richard, I'll pass to you as the final panelist.
Okay. Two sort of slightly random thoughts. Firstly, the good cities are going to be really great. Lots of empty office accommodation is going to be turned into housing. So people will walk to work. It'll take them 10 minutes. It'll be great. They'll be able to go to their local shops. It'll be really good. We'll have electric autonomous vehicles, which people will borrow. Great improvement on what we've got at the moment. It's going to be a significant improvement of quality of life in some cities for some people, really positive. Other cities, other people might be not just left behind, but pushed back further than they are at the moment. That's the first thought. Second thought, I'm just doing a project in Hackney, trying to map the green economy in Hackney and talking to lots and lots of businesses. And there are lots of really small businesses. They're really interesting. They're doing a whole variety of things, deliveries on bicycles, and people who are putting really clever meters into buildings in order to improve people's energy use. There's a whole variety. For these businesses, networking and informality is really important. They talk to one another. They're not interested in planning. They're interested in really simple networking with one another. So it's not just about people like us working it all out intellectually and then deciding what the world's going to be like. It's also about trying to create a system in which the world is run by autonomous networks and people can work out their own decisions between them. And sure, it'll be messy, but it could be a lot of fun as well.
Thanks, Richard. I think it's great to end on a positive note about innovation and collaboration. Just been trying to get my daughter's school to consider doing a community solar, and I was really quite surprised by the number of people committed to driving that forward in their own time, actually, locally. So maybe that's a nice positive note to end on and to pass on to Ian Maddox as chair of Happel Foundation, who's going to close the session for us.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Very well chaired, and thanks ever so much to the panel. I think when people listen back to the recording of this, they will learn an awful lot, and I think there's an awful lot here, especially with the diversity of the panel and the different ways that people have come at the issues. I think there's an awful lot to learn here. This has been a very successful conversation, and thank you to everyone that attended, and a special thanks to everyone that participated in the actual discussion. I look forward to the next city conversation. When it'll be and what it'll be, I'm sure will come out into your inboxes soon enough. But for now, goodbye and see you next time.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.